Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to talk about the best short novels or novellas. I have been thinking about doing this video for about a month now, and it's been something that has been sort of growing and I've been thinking about a lot because I'm really into short novels or novellas right now, and this seems like a very timely moment to do it because we're a little past Shorty September, but there used to be a thing called Novellas in November. I don't know how much of a thing that is anymore because I really don't see many people at all talking about it, but it was a thing when I first started this channel and I enjoyed it. So I always go back to it and think about it in November, even if I don't actively participate in it. So this just seemed like a good time to do a video like this about the best short novels or novellas that you can use in Novellas in November or beyond, whatever you would like. I am going to try something a little different in this video. I asked for your favorite short novels or novellas in a comment, and at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about some of those. I did eliminate books that were mentioned in comments that didn't meet the criteria that I have laid out. I'll explain the criteria in a moment. I'm going to start with my favorites, the ones that I have really enjoyed and recommend, and why this is something that I am a little bit passionate about promoting, because I love short stories for sure. And I know there are a lot of people who don't love short stories, but I also love short novels and novellas. I feel like it is frequently sort of assumed in the unconscious part of your mind that a book needs to be really long and in-depth and just kind of massive in order to be considered important. But these books are slim and yet pack powerful emotional punches, and I think they are just as worthy of praise as any really long book. I have read many long books that feel like you could have edited them way down, and I have read many short books that feel like they really could have benefited from expanding. Both things are true. However, one is not right and one is not wrong. You have really great examples of literature in both. So I wanted to celebrate the best of the short novels or novellas. And I'm also going to talk about some short novels or novellas that are on my reading list, like my TBR pile, if you want to call it that. I prefer to use the term pile of possibilities. So these are books that are widely regarded to be among the best, but I haven't read them yet, so I can't really recommend them on my own. So they will be in the middle, and then we will get to the ones that you like. My criteria for this is that every book must be 200 pages or less. This was hard because there were a lot of books that I wanted to include or that people commented to include that were not much over 200 pages, but this was my really hard line. I interpreted the other criteria a little bit loosely, but this was a hard line that I drew. I figured 200 pages would be the maximum. And again, unfortunately, there were some books that went over it, and I did not include them at all. The other criteria is that these books should exist separately from short story collections or be differentiated from other stories or novellas in a collection. So ideally, these are books that would exist on their own, but in certain cases where they were originally published in a story collection or with other novellas, they should be able to stand out from the others in some way. And when we get to an example of that latter criteria, I will explain. So I interpreted the latter one a little bit loosely because, again, there is one book that is in a collection of novellas, but I'll explain why I think it still fits when we get to it. And with that, let's begin. The first book that I want to recommend as one of the best is the book that really started me on this journey. It is Small Things Like These by Keegan. I know a lot of people have read this book over the last year, but I read it in January, so I read it within this calendar year, and it will probably be coming up on my best reads of the year. It was a finalist for the Booker Prize, and that was kind of shocking to a lot of people. It was the shortest book at 116 pages to make it on the long list, and then it was the shortest book to be on the short list, and I really think it deserved to be there. Small Things Like These is a very powerful novella. In a short amount of pages, it really does a great job setting the world, setting the stakes, and leaving you without answers necessarily, but with enough to go on that you can kind of make assumptions about where the story will go from there. And that is something that I think a lot of people don't like about short stories in particular. They tend to be a little more open-ended. They don't have very satisfying conclusions. And I think part of the reason there's a bit of a bias against short novels and novellas is that they tend to lean into that a little bit. And I think Small Things Like These manages to have it both ways. And I really liked that a lot about it. This is a very powerful book. It was definitely worthy of being on the shortlist for the Booker Prize. And it's just a great piece of literature. It doesn't matter that it is only 116 pages. It is a fantastic book. And for the most part, I'm going to try not to include multiple books by one author, but I feel like I kind of have to just mention Foster by Claire Keegan, which was just released in the United States. I had a copy pre-ordered, and spoiler alert for my book haul for this month, I got a copy and I've actually already read it. And spoiler alert for when I actually talk about this in a Friday Reads video, I do think this is a case where the book would have benefited a little bit from expanding a little bit more. It could have been longer, but it is also beautiful. And I feel like I just have to mention it because when I mention or talk about Small Things Like These, Foster comes up a lot. So it's not part of my official list. I'm just throwing it in there because I feel like when you talk about Small Things Like These, people really go to Foster, which was originally published, I think, in 2010 in the UK, but was only just released in the US based on the reaction to Small Things Like These. The next book I want to talk about, for real, on my best list is Now in November by Josephine Johnson. I actually just finished this book and I really wanted to include it. So if you look online, there are a lot of different editions of this book, and some of them go slightly over 200 pages, but my edition is exactly 200 pages. And here's my thinking on this. My edition has illustrations throughout and some big chapter breaks, and the type is fairly large. The margins are fairly large, which makes it really easy to read. So if my version, which has illustrations and like page breaks and all of that stuff, is 200 pages, it seems fair to include this as a book that is 200 pages or less, although there are editions out there that are a little more. That's my excuse for this. Now in November is a Pulitzer Prize winner. That is why it ended up on my radar and why I got this Franklin Library edition of it, because I love these for my Pulitzer books that I'm reading as part of my project to read every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I feel like this book is sort of on the verge of being rediscovered, and that's a great thing because it is a fantastic book about family and farming and a little bit about socioeconomic things, but they're kind of lingering in the background and coming into the story. I'm going to have a lot more to say about this when I do my Pulitzer Prize deep dive, which I am currently working on, because there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about in this book, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about with Josephine Johnson as well. It's a great book. I absolutely recommend it, and I can't wait to talk about it more, but I am so glad that I finished it in time to include it on this list. The other thing that sent me on this journey or this line of thinking where I wanted to create this video to promote short novels and novellas is Train Dreams by Denis Johnson. I read this book when it was published in 2012. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. It is the book that I think should have won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012, a year that is really maddening because it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The board was unable to reach a conclusion about what should win, so there was no winner. And it's just frustrating because this, to me, is the book that should have won, and it was right there. It's a short book. It is 116 pages, I believe. Yes, it is 116 pages. And I love it. I think it's great. Like Small Things Like These, it is one of the best examples of what short fiction can do. It has a very contained story and is yet also very emotionally affecting. I love it. And I reread it in April or May because I did that video about the Pulitzer Prize controversy from 2012. I'll link that video down below. I talk about this much more at length in that video. And coming not long after I read Small Things Like These, it really sort of set me on this path where right now I'm reading a lot of short novels and novellas toward the end of the year because the 1-2 punch of Small Things Like These and then my reread of Train Dreams really just kind of showed me the impact of what they can do. Another book that I finished recently and which has sort of helped create this mood that I'm in where I'm really seeking out a lot of short novels and novellas is Winter Love by Suyin. I read this on audio and loved it enough that I went out and got a copy of this book. There's a little bit of a dust jacket on the paperback that is very reflective, so I hope you can see the image. It sort of perfectly captures the mood of this book. It was published in 1962. It is really great. If you've ever read Patricia Highsmith, particularly The Price of Salt or Carol, this is a good book for you. It is about two women who are in love in World War II. They are in college. One of them is married to a man, and it is about the difficulties of them trying to be together and the impact that it can have on their psyche. The protagonist can be really angry and lash out at times, and that makes this a very unconventional romance, but it's a really beautiful story contained in a very small package. It is 153 pages, and again, it has this beautiful, contained, emotional story within, and I would totally recommend it to you. The next book is something that I read toward the end of last year. It's Zorrie by Laird Hunt. It was one of my favorite reads from last year. I'll put a link to that video in the description box down below as well, where I talked about this. And maybe you could say that this one is actually the book that sort of set the genesis for this little journey I've been on with short novels and novellas, because I read it at the end of last year and then 2022 started with Small Things Like These. But I think Small Things Like These is really the thing that kicked it into overdrive. I loved Zorrie. It was a finalist for the National Book Award last year. It did not win. I have not read the book that won, but I just loved Zorrie. It also would have been a great contender for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but it was not even a contender for that. It's a story about a woman. It's a story about life. It's a story about how time passes. And again, just in this short page count, it really punches you in all the feels. And I really admire what Laird Hunt was able to do. It's an almost perfect book. There's nothing you could add or expand on. You certainly could, and the detail would be great. But as it is, it feels spare and sparse in a way that is almost haunting, and I would absolutely recommend it. I'm going to keep saying I recommend these books because I, obviously, and especially in this section, these are the books that I have read and can for sure recommend to you. The next book comes from one of my favorite authors, and it was actually her debut. It's The Bluest by Toni Morrison. This is an astonishing debut for a lot of reasons because, first of all, it comes in at 160 pages, and like all of the others, it packs a lot of messaging, a lot of emotion, a lot of story, and just a lot into such a small page count, and it's kind of perfect. Again, you could expand on any of the details and it would probably be fascinating, but the fact that it's such a tight story is really impressive, especially, again, since it was a debut. Toni Morrison is an author who really emerged with her full voice and authority as a writer, and she had an almost perfect vision for everything that she was going to do and accomplish in her career. That is pretty rare. The only author I can really think of off the top of my head who has done a similar thing is Louise Erdrich, who debuted with Love Medicine. This is a fantastic book, and it's a very small book. It is difficult. There are trigger warnings in here. There's like sexual assault and lots of racism and violence and a lot of that stuff. It's a Toni Morrison book. It deals with very heavy topics, and I think part of the genius of it is that it is so small, because in such a small package, it feels manageable to get through all of the difficult things that this book talks about, and yet it doesn't lack any of the resonance for being short. It's a brilliant book. It really launched Toni Morrison's career pretty perfectly. I love it. I love it a lot, and I know a lot of other people have read it and enjoyed it as well. The next book is another classic. It is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Really, there's no way to do this list and not include it somewhere. Thankfully, I have read it and enjoyed it. It's 101 pages, and again, it packs so much into this. And I think, again, the size is perfect, because if this was any longer, the sort of gimmick behind the story could get a little bit too labored. Obviously, it's an allegory that uses animals on a farm to make a very social message about politics and government and human nature. And the longer this book is, the more that starts to strain. So the fact that it's short feels very perfect. and it sort of enhances the sort of allegory, because an allegory can almost seem like a fairy tale in the right hands, and George Orwell definitely sort of pulls that off. It's a book that talks about a lot of different things, and again, manages to do it in a very small page count and without feeling like you're being spoon-fed a bunch of vegetables in the way that a lot of classic literature or like political literature can. And this is pointedly political, but not in a heavy-handed way to me. The next one is another classic. It's Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. I am not a particular lover of John Steinbeck's literature, although I have not read his biggest, like literally his biggest works, East of Eden and The Grapes of Wrath, although I will be reading The Grapes of Wrath as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. I do think he's a pretty undeniable writer, though, and he has written a lot of short novels and novellas, and there were certainly options for this. I think of them, I need to go with Of Mice and Men, because it's a story that really... He's written a lot of stories that stick with you, but I think the one I refer to the most is Of Mice and Men, and the one that I hear other people refer to the most is also Of Mice and Men. There are people who will love other ones, The Red Pony, The Pearl. I think Cannery Row would meet the criteria for being under 200 pages, but I don't have that in front of me. But for me, it has to be Of Mice and Men. It's a great story about the relationship between these two men. And it's definitely a tragic book, and it sits with you long after you have read it. So again, even though I'm not a big lover of John Steinbeck's work, I feel like it needs to be included here. The next one is the one that sort of blurs the line between my criteria of something that really needs to stand out from a short story collection or a collection of novellas. It's Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King, which is published in the book Different Seasons. And the gimmick of this book is that it's actually 4 novellas kind of themed around the seasons. You have Hope Springs Eternal, spring, Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption. That's the category that falls under. Summer of Corruption, which is where you get Apt Pupil. Fall from Innocence, which is where you get The Body, and A Winter's Tale, which is where you get The Breathing Method. The Breathing Method is the one that like nobody talks about in this book. The Body is referred to on its own all the time. It was turned into the movie Stand By Me. Apt Pupil was obviously also turned into a movie, and Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption was turned into the movie The Shawshank Redemption. So here's my thinking on this. Even though technically Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption is intrinsically part of this book, Different Seasons, those 3 novellas, Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, Apt Pupil, and The Body, definitely all exist in the public consciousness on their own. And I'm not sure a lot of people would even realize that they exist in this format in print. So I'm allowing that to mean that it can stand on its own. I know there are a lot of people who get very upset about Stephen King being quality literature. And here's my stance on that. Stephen King is up and down and all over the place. There are good books, there are bad books, there are great books, and there are very mediocre books. His career is all over the place, but there are great books, and there's really great writing. Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption is fantastic. And I would kind of challenge you, if you don't like Stephen King, read it, and it might change your perception on him. Again, he's written some real clunkers in his career. I'm not here to defend his entire body of work, but Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption is the real deal. All of the groundwork for the movie The Shawshank Redemption was laid in that book, and it is pretty fantastic to me. The next one is a book that I am actually hoping to reread at some point soon, because I read it in the past. I read this when I was about 20, 21 years old, and I don't remember a lot of the details. I just remember really loving it. And I would like to reread it so I can get all of that back again. But I know I really loved it when I read it, and I'm looking forward to rediscovering it. It's The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. This is a 25th anniversary edition. I, again, just remember really liking it. It has such short little chapters, should be really easy to get through. So not only is this a short novel, it also would be really easy to get through because, again, short chapters coming in little bursts. But I remember loving it and thinking about it for a long time after reading it. It's just that it's been roughly 20 years since I read it, and a lot has happened since then. So I definitely want to reread this, but I remember absolutely loving it. There's no way I couldn't include it on this list, and hopefully I will be rereading it soon, especially since I'm on this short novels and novellas kick at the moment, so it kind of perfectly fits with where I am at. The next one is a book that I'm sure a lot of people have not heard of. The only person I know who had read this book when I picked it up is Sean the Book Maniac. It's The Gift of the Body by Rebecca Brown. I read this, I think, in 2019. I wasn't sure I liked this book when I first was reading it because it's very emotionally distant. It's about 163 pages, and it follows someone who is a caretaker for people who are dying of AIDS. And it feels like you are very apart from everything that's happening for the first half of the book. And then in the second half of the book, you realize that the reason that's happening is that this caretaker has had to put up walls between them and the patients, the people they see, and just their whole life, because everything surrounding them is emotionally devastating. And then the walls start to crumble in the second half of the book. And it is just beautiful and sad and heartbreaking. I believe this is still in print. You probably would have to order it, but if you can find a copy, it is a really fantastic, affecting book. And again, I think if it was any longer than this, it would almost be unbearable because it is so emotional. And I think it's pretty perfect in this form. The next book is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. I have this tiny little Picador Modern Classics version that is sort of designed to be pocket-sized, and this is a wonderful book. You may have seen the movie with Colin Firth, but the book is beautiful. It's angry and sad and kind of funny in parts. It is about a man who is grieving the loss of his lover, and he loves the world. He enjoys being part of it, but he's also really angry at the world. I believe it's set within a single day, and it's a beautiful book that provokes a lot of emotion in you and is pretty perfect in its tiny little size, I think. The next one is a recent book. It is Elena Knows, translated by Frances Riddle. This was a finalist for the International Booker last year, and again, I think if this book was any longer, it would be almost unbearable because, for one thing, I think you know where this book is going from the beginning. So if it were any longer, it would be unbearable, like, okay, just get to it. And also because there's a lot of difficult stuff in here. It is about a woman who has difficulty getting around because she is basically at war with her body, which is deteriorating because of a medical condition that she has. She's grieving the loss of her daughter, who was her caretaker and committed suicide. And she is desperate to prove that her daughter did not commit suicide. And so she is trying to manage her medication so she will be able to get out and go on like one last ditch effort to try to prove that it was not a suicide. And it's a heavy book. If it were any longer, it would be unbearable. It is, let's find out, 140 pages, and that's about perfect for this. It's a beautiful book. It is devastating and emotional, and I think part of why it is able to be so devastating is because it's in such a short form, and I would absolutely recommend it to you if you can stomach it. The next one is Department of Speculation by Jenny Ofel. This is a bit of an oddity because usually I don't respond to books like this that are a little bit quirky and a little bit offbeat and trying to, play with form to a degree. I used to like them a lot more than I do now, but somehow this one got through. It's a novel in letters. It's about a marriage that is sort of crumbling, and it is beautiful and different, kind of quirky, offbeat. The quote on the back of the book from Michael Cunningham is, Jenny Ofel's Department of Speculation resembles no book I've read before. If I tell you that it's funny and moving and true, that it's as compact and mysterious as a neutron, that it tells a profound story of love and parenthood while invoking, among others, Keats, Kafka, Einstein, Russian cosmonauts, and advice for the housewife of 1897, will you please simply believe me and read it? And I think that's a pretty perfect encapsulation of this book. Jamie's starting to bark. Don't know what she's looking at, but we're going to try to soldier through and keep going, and maybe she'll calm down. The next one is Passing by Nella Larson. Now, this book definitely exists on its own. However, I have it as part of a collection with another novella and some stories that Nella Larson wrote, and this is just a fantastic book. It feels like this was sort of a forgotten classic for a long time, something that people didn't really think about much at all. And over the last 10, 15, 20 years, People have really rediscovered this book and put it back on the map, and it deserves to be there. It is a fantastic book about race and marriage and set in New York City, and I love it. It's a really great book. It was one of my favorite books that I read last year as well. And again, that video will be down below. Joel read it last year and loved it as well. It's a stunning book, and it achieves a lot in a short page count for sure. The next one, I had a bit of a tough time when I read it because it feels like it has inspired literature that followed it so much that it feels almost like a cliche at this point, but you have to acknowledge that when it was published, it was groundbreaking, and that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I actually listened to this on audio, I think maybe 2 years ago at this point. And again, it feels very familiar now. You can kind of see where the end is going to go, but the fact that the reason it feels familiar is that it inspired so many other authors to do similar things and tricks with their narrative. Really just shows how groundbreaking and what a masterpiece it is. And Shirley Jackson, this is the only book of hers that no, that's not true. I read The Haunting of Hill House back a long time ago, and I don't really remember much about it. Clearly, I forgot I had read it in the first place. But this is a great book, despite the fact that I think it feels very familiar to someone in the current era who is picking it up and listening to it or reading it. Then we get to Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, an LGBTQ+ classic, and just a classic of literature. I think this is a bit of a difficult book. It's not a happy book. A lot of the books on here are not happy, but it plays with form in a very interesting way. It says a lot of interesting things. James Baldwin is sort of a master anyway, and I love it. Then there is The Bridge of San Luis Rey by Thornton Wilder. This is another book I am very much hoping to reread as part of my Pulitzer Prize project because it won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction a long time ago. I did read this book when I was roughly 20 years old, and I remember really liking it, but feeling very sort of distant from what it was doing. And I wonder if I will not feel that distance at 40. So it's something I'm really looking forward to revisiting as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. However, even though I felt that sort of distance from it at age 20, I thought it was like a masterfully written book and said a lot of kind of deep and profound things, again, in a very short space, and I look forward to revisiting it as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. And then the final book for the list of my favorite short novels and novellas is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, here's the thing. I'm not a huge lover of A Christmas Carol, to be honest. However, I think it is arguably the most impactful short novel or novella in like the Western world, because who doesn't know A Christmas Carol? Odds are you've seen a movie either directly adapted from the novel or just inspired from it. You've seen a stage play or a musical based on it. You've probably read it in school. I was assigned to read it in 7th grade. Nobody in the Western world really escapes A Christmas Carol, especially since it is so seasonal. We're heading into prime A Christmas Carol season at the time that I am filming this, and I think that really says a lot and makes it undeniable. So that was 20 books that I would consider my favorite short novels and novellas. Now we're going to quickly cover 20 books that I have not yet read that fit this category, and which I'm really hoping to get to at some point. The first one is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I have this beautiful Penguin Great Books of the 20th Century edition, and I haven't read it, and it feels like something I really need to get to at some point, so hopefully I will. We're gonna move really quickly through these. The next one is The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. I've actually never read a Tolstoy book, and this feels like it would be a lot more accessible than War and Peace. By the way, I should also mention, in cases like Elena Knows, where there is a specific translator and that's it, that's the one translator, I am going to try to mention them when we get to the part where you recommended books. If you recommended a specific translation, I am going to mention that translator. But for things like this, where there are so many different versions of it out there, I'm just going to mention the title of the book and the author and leave it at that. And we are going to continue with The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. This is something that I will be reading at some point for my Pulitzer Prize project. And Joel actually read it and enjoyed it, I think, earlier this year. And I've read Hemingway's short stories. I have not read one of his novels or novellas, so that's another reason I'm really looking forward to this one. There's also A Death in Venice by Thomas Mann, and this I'm including, even though it is usually included with other short stories by Thomas Mann, because every time it's included, it's A Death in Venice and other stories. So the star of the story collections is always Death in Venice, and I think that gives it the separation from the other stories. Like, it's not Death in Venice, a short story collection, it's A Death in Venice and other stories. So I feel like it meets the criteria. And so many people have recommended A Death in Venice to me, and I haven't gotten around to it yet, but hopefully I will be fixing that at some point in the near future. But, you know, there are so many things to read. We'll see how that goes. The next one is The Awakening by Kate Chopin. I just have kind of vaguely intended to get to this book for a really long time and haven't, and at some point I will do it. I don't know when. I don't even own a copy of it, but at some point I will do it. And the same goes with A River Runs Through It by Norman Maclean, and I think this is going to be something that I'm going to include as an addendum for my Pulitzer Prize project, because it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in a year where there was no winner. I think the fact that there was no winner that year has a lot more to do with something else that we'll get to as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. But the other thing that makes me really drawn to Whoever Runs Through It is that it is set in Missoula, Montana, and I live in Missoula, Montana. I've seen the movie. I have not read the book, and I need to get around to doing that. That takes us to Brickmakers by Silva Almada, translated from the Spanish by Annie McDermott. This is a pretty recent book, or at least it has recently been translated into English. It is copyright 2013, and it was, I think, translated into English 2021. And it's funny, the book looks fairly long, but it is 181 pages. I've heard really great things about this, and I am definitely looking forward to reading it. Waiting for Eden by Elliot Ackerman was recommended to me by Chelsea from the Montana Book Company. She is one of the owners of that store. It sounds fascinating, so this is another one that I'm really looking forward to getting to, hopefully soon. It is 125 pages. There are other books I could have included by Albert Camus, but I went with A Stranger because it's the one that I own, and I am trying to limit myself to one per author. So here it is, the one that I own, The Stranger by Albert Camus. Another one I've been meaning to get to for a long time and failing at is Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata, a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I just haven't made it happen yet. And at some point I will, because I really want to. And maybe now that I'm kind of on this kick with short novels and novellas, I'll get to a lot of these, but we'll see. Again, there's so many things to read, and it's hard to get to all of them and know what to prioritize when. There's also The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. I've heard so many great things about this book, and I would love to get to it. I've never read a Yoko Ogawa book, and I would really like to. For this one, I will mention the translator. It is Stephen Snyder. A book that I'm going to try to cram in this year because it will fit a prompt for Montana Book Company's reading challenge for 2022 is The Women of Brewster Place by Gloria Naylor. This is kind of cheating because it's a novel in 7 stories. So it kind of blurs the line between novella and story collection, and I'm trying not to include story collections, but because it's sort of a linked story through those individual stories, I am including it on this list. And it is a book that I've been meaning to read for a very long time. It is 192 pages. And I'm really looking forward to getting to it at long last because it's been a journey. And then there is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. This is translated by John Nathan. Haven't read any Yukio Mishima and would really like to at some point. We'll see how that goes. I've heard mixed things about The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, but I'm interested in the story anyway. There's also Breakfast on Pluto by Patrick McCabe. This is something that was a finalist for the Booker Prize. And it's probably very dated because it is about a transgender character, and it was published 20 years ago, maybe more. And that is part of the fascination. I want to see how much this holds up. It was copyright 1998. And we'll see. We'll find out when I finally get around to reading it. The next one is Franny, the Queen of Provincetown by John Preston. Odds are you haven't heard of this book. I had not heard of it either until I discovered these Little Sisters classics. So Arsenal Pulp Press found queer books that were in danger of being forgotten and put them back in print through this series, and this is one of the ones that I picked up. And it's a short book, really hoping to get to it because I think it would be fascinating, and I love the idea of rediscovering sort of lost queer classics. And then we have Olivia by Dorothy Strachey. Again, I've heard kind of mixed things about this one, but it's a short enough book that I'll get to it at some point and see what I think for myself, because I've also heard really great things about it, and we'll see how that goes. Then there is Cain by Jean Toomer, which was gifted to me by Erica from The Broken Spine, and which I think Brian from Bookish read recently, and what both of them have said about it really inspired me to try to get to this at some point. Hopefully it'll be on the docket for next year. We'll see how that goes. It is from the Harlem Renaissance, I believe, and it was published in 1923, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what I think of it when I get to it. And then we have O Pioneers by Willa Cather. I've only read My Antonia by Willa Cather, which does not fit the qualifications here because it's over 200 pages. The book of hers that does is O Pioneers, and unfortunately I think I'm going to have to get to a different book of hers next, one of ours, which I don't think is one of her more well-known books, except for the fact that it's the book of hers that won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. But O Pioneers is the one that my interest naturally gravitates toward. So it is what it is. And we have A Boy's Own Story by Edmund White, which barely qualifies for this, I believe. It is 196 pages, so it just makes the page count limit. It is a queer classic. I've been meaning to read Edmund White for years at this point and have not gotten around to it, so hopefully I will be fixing that at some point soon. And then the final book for my TBR is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Now, again, this is really short. It's basically the length of a short story, but I'm including it because it definitely stands out from all of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's other stories. And I worked at a Borders for years, and they always assigned The Yellow Wallpaper for summer reading for the, I think, senior grade. I could be wrong about that. And not any of her other stories. So in my mind, Yellow Wallpaper exists on its own. And for that reason, it's on my TBR of short novels or novellas that I would like to get to. Now, let's transition to the ones that you recommended. Some of these are titles that I have already talked about, but that's just interesting. And I was kind of hoping that people would be recommending the same books so I could kind of rank them. Like, these are the ones that the most people recommended. And that didn't actually happen, which is kind of interesting, actually. The best I can do is that there are two books that somebody else commented on the original comment to agree that it's a great book. So I'm going to mention those two first. And the first of those is The Gurkha and the Lord of Tuesday by Saeed Z. Hossein. This was recommended by Ames for Books and sort of seconded by Sarah K. And it sounds really interesting. So I had never heard of this book, and if you haven't either, I encourage you to look it up because it sounds fascinating. And the other one that got two sort of comments is Recitative by Toni Morrison. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It was mentioned by Sheila Birch and then sort of seconded by Laura Testa. And this is definitely on my list of things to get to, especially as I work my way through Toni Morrison's books. So at some point I will get to it, but I have not read it yet. Then we get into the ones that only have one comment. The first one is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I did read this book 20 years ago, and I remember almost nothing about it. So at some point I would probably reread it, but I remember really liking it when I did read it. The next one recommended by a commenter takes us back to A Death in Venice. This was recommended by Regina Lemoyne, and again, is something that I am also really looking forward to. The next book recommended by commenters is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, translated by Ginny Tapley Takamori. It was recommended by Thompson Day. I did really enjoy that book. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites, which is why you didn't see it in my sort of top 20, but it is a great book and I would recommend it. I did not like the other book of Sayaka Murata's that I've read, but Convenience Store Woman is great and I would recommend it. Then there was another recommendation for The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. That was recommended by Lisa Kay. And then we had another recommendation for Small Things Like These. I don't know where it is in my pile anymore, but you saw it earlier. It was recommended by AJ Paperback. And AJ Paperback also threw in a recommendation for the Murderbot series, and I'm going to allow it even though there is one book in the Murderbot series that is a full-length novel, I think over 300 pages. However, all of the other books in the series are novella length. I happened to just get All Systems Red, which is the first book in the series, from the library. I read it. It's good. Again, I wouldn't include it in my top 20, but I totally understand why there are a lot of people who would, and it is a spare 149 pages. The other books in the series are roughly the same length, except for, again, that one book that is sort of outside the original narrative of the series. And then there is a shout out for A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens from Laura Testa. So thank you for backing me up on that, Laura. And then there is a recommendation for A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. That came from Heidi from the channel My Reading Life. I read the description of this book when I looked it up and actually added it to my wish list on bookshop.org because it sounds really good. So I'm going to have to check that one out. And thank you for the recommendation, Heidi. Then there is The Dry Heart by Natalia Ginsburg, translated by Francis Finet, that was recommended by Jaded Diamonds. Another one I haven't read, had not heard of at all, but sounds kind of interesting. Then there is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. That was recommended by Sandra Zucks. I haven't read it. I tried to limit my to-read list to 20 books, but it's on my pile of things that I should get to at some point. And then there is another shout out for Now in November by Josephine Johnson, which is buried in this pile. I'm not going to dig it out, but that came from Kim from Middle of the Book March. She has a great channel as well. And I know she is a fan of this book. She actually just reread it as well. So great that there's another fan out there and spreading the gospel of Now in November. Then there's another book I had not heard of, The Wedding of Zayn by Talib Saleh, translated by Dennis Johnson Davies. This was recommended by Fatima Muhammad. And another book that sounds really interesting and that I had not heard of, although Talib Saleh is an author who is on my list because of the LGBTQ+ in translation read-along that I am participating in. Then there is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers, recommended by Caleb A. Stone in a Landslide by Maria Barbal, translated by Laura McLaughlin. That was recommended by Stu's Translated Fiction Corner. The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. That was recommended by Lori Romer and is also on my list of books that I would like to get to in this category. The Moon is Down by John Steinbeck. It was recommended by Whispers in the Dark, 86. And that is a John Steinbeck book that I was not familiar with at all. So thank you, Whispers in the Dark, 86. That one just completely slipped by me. I did not know anything about it. And then there is Sula by Toni Morrison. This was recommended by The Darkest Reads. Obviously, I'm working my way through Toni Morrison's books, and I'm trying to pick which one of her books I want to read next, and I do think it is Sula. So I didn't include it in the 20 books that are on my TBR, but rest assured, I do want to read it, and I'm going to read it someday. Maybe soon, maybe not. We'll see. And then the final one recommended by commenters is The Grass Harp by Truman Capote, which is another one I was kind of unfamiliar with, and it was recommended by Sebastian Behan. There was also a recommendation for Malva by Maxim Gorky. I can't really find much about it online. It seems like it might just be a short story, but I'm going to throw it out there. It was recommended by Sarah Kay. That one, I couldn't really find enough information to determine whether or not it really qualifies, so I'm going to put it there. If you have other recommendations of short novels or novellas, try to fit the criteria. Again, 200 pages or less, and should exist on their own in some format. And again, that is open to interpretation. Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption exists in a collection of novellas, but I think in the public consciousness, it exists on its own. So it kind of qualifies for me. So if you have recommendations for books that meet that criteria, let me know in the comment section down below, because again, I'm really on a tear with short novels and novellas at the moment. I think they're fantastic. I hope that you have gotten some good recommendations from this or gotten some ideas of other areas to sort of spin out and explore on your own. But if you have other recommendations, if you have thoughts about the books that I've included, thoughts about what books I should prioritize from my to be read list, let me know in the comment section down below. And as always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.